The Cold War did not feel cold to the people inside it. That description, the one that has been repeated in textbooks and documentaries and political speeches for decades, was always a convenience. It was a way of packaging something that had no clean edges into a phrase that made it manageable. The truth, which took years to surface in declassified documents and survivor testimonies and institutional audits, is that the Cold War was a continuous near miss. It was a sequence of moments in which catastrophe was deferred, not through wisdom, not through restraint, but through mechanical failure, bureaucratic delay, and the occasional decision by a single individual to do nothing when protocol demanded everything. The 20 programs described here were not marginal. They were not fringe operations conducted by rogue actors outside the chain of command. They were institutional. They were funded, staffed, and maintained by the governments of the most powerful nations in human history, and then, for reasons that varied from embarrassment to strategic necessity to simple denial, they were removed from the official record. Some were declassified decades later. Some remain partially obscured. A few are known only through the testimony of the people who built them or survived their consequences. What they share is a logic that was entirely consistent with the period in which they operated. The Cold War created a bureaucratic architecture of destruction. It built systems designed to function without hesitation, without deliberation, and in many cases, without human beings at all. The assumption built into every one of these programs was that the other side was already preparing to strike. The rational response to that assumption, repeated at every level of every institution on both sides of the divide, was to build something that could respond before the strike arrived, or survive it, or make it so catastrophic for the attacker that the strike would never come in the first place. That logic produced a world that was perpetually ready to end itself, and the programs described here are the evidence of how far that readiness actually went. The first program most people have never heard of operated under the name Project Gabriel, and it began not with a weapon, but with a question. In the late 1940s, American scientists working in the aftermath of nuclear testing started noticing something that had not been anticipated in the theoretical models. The fallout from atomic detonations was not staying where the models predicted. It was traveling further, settling in unexpected places, and accumulating in biological tissue in ways that raised immediate long-term concerns. Project Gabriel was the classified study commissioned to determine exactly how much radioactive contamination the global environment could absorb before human reproduction was compromised at a population level. The question was not whether nuclear testing was dangerous. The question was how much danger could be tolerated before the species itself was at risk. The findings, which remained classified for years, were alarming enough that they contributed directly to the negotiations that eventually produced the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. But the existence of the project itself, the fact that the United States government had formally investigated the threshold of human biological tolerance for nuclear contamination as a matter of strategic planning, was not something that entered public discourse. The program was real, the data was real, and the conclusion embedded in that data, that the testing programs of both superpowers were approaching limits that could not be crossed without permanent biological consequences, was filed, classified, and managed administratively rather than disclosed. Following Gabriel came a program with a different scope and a different kind of institutional silence. Operation Sunshine, which ran in the 1950s, was a systematic global collection of human tissue samples used to measure the distribution of strontium-90, a radioactive isotope produced by nuclear detonations in human bones. The program collected samples from hospitals, morgues, and medical facilities across multiple countries. In some cases, the samples were taken from deceased infants without the knowledge or consent of the families. The data produced was scientifically significant. It confirmed that strontium-90 was accumulating in human bone tissue at measurable rates across populations that had no direct exposure to nuclear testing sites. It was evidence that the atmospheric testing programs were distributing their byproducts globally and embedding them in human bodies at every latitude. The program was not publicly acknowledged for decades. The families whose children had contributed samples without consent never knew. The data was used to inform policy decisions about testing, but the method of collection and the scope of what it revealed about contamination were managed internally. Operation Sunshine represents a specific kind of institutional behavior that appeared repeatedly throughout the Cold War. When the knowledge produced by a program was too uncomfortable to disclose, or when the method of obtaining that knowledge could not survive public scrutiny, the program was maintained in silence, while its conclusions shaped decisions made in public. The distant early warning line, known as the DW line, was not secret in the way that these first two programs were secret. It was a known infrastructure, a chain of radar stations stretching across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland, built in the 1950s to provide advance warning of Soviet bombers approaching North America over the polar route. What was not publicly known, and what remained classified for years, was the degree to which the DW line was not actually capable of performing its stated function with any reliability. The stations were isolated, understaffed, and subject to atmospheric conditions that degraded their radar performance in ways that were understood by engineers but not communicated clearly to the policymakers who relied on the system as a guarantee. There were multiple incidents in the DW line's operational history in which ambiguous radar returns triggered alert conditions that moved up the chain of command before being resolved as non-events. A solar storm in 1967 produced electromagnetic interference across the DW line that for a period of minutes appeared consistent with a Soviet attack. The Strategic Air Command was in the process of responding when the interference was identified. The margin between a false alarm and a launch authorization was not wide enough to be comfortable, and the people who understood that margin kept what they knew within the institution. The DW line was presented publicly as a reliable shield. Internally, it was understood as a system operating at the edge of its technical capacity in conditions that regularly stressed that edge. Alongside the radar infrastructure, the United States maintained a program that represented perhaps the most direct expression of institutional logic about nuclear war. The program was called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP, and it was the classified document that specified exactly how the United States would conduct nuclear war if war came. The first version of the SIOP, completed in 1960, called for the simultaneous delivery of the entire American nuclear arsenal against the Soviet Union, China, and the Soviet satellite states. The projected casualties in the first version ran to hundreds of millions. The plan did not include options for limited strikes. It did not include provisions for targeting military installations while sparing population centers. It was a single, total response designed to be executed in full. The civilians in the Kennedy administration who first saw the SIOP were reportedly horrified. The plan had been developed entirely within the military structure, and it reflected a set of assumptions about nuclear war that treated it as a conventional military operation conducted at scale, rather than as something categorically different. The existence of the SIOP was not secret in the sense that its existence was unknown, but its contents, the specific casualty projections, the all-or-nothing structure of the response options, the degree to which the plan effectively removed presidential decision-making from the process by structuring the response as a single unified action, remained classified and were managed carefully within the national security apparatus. The problem the SIOP created was not primarily tactical. It was political. If the only nuclear option available to the United States was the complete destruction of the Soviet Union, China, and their allies, then any crisis that seemed to be moving toward nuclear exchange was also moving toward a response that could not be limited or calibrated. The plan was eventually revised to include more options. But the first version, and the institutional thinking that produced it, revealed something important about how the Cold War was actually being managed at its highest levels. The bureaucratic machinery of nuclear war had developed its own logic. And that logic did not require or particularly want civilian input. The Soviet Union maintained a parallel structure of institutional silence around its own programs, and the details of those programs became available to Western researchers only slowly, through defector testimony, archival releases following the Soviet collapse, and the work of historians who spent decades piecing together fragments. One of the most significant of those programs was the system known as perimeter, or by its American designation, dead hand. The system was developed in the late 1970s and early 1980s in response to a specific Soviet concern. American advances in missile accuracy and the deployment of the Pershing II missile in Europe had created a scenario in which a decapitating first strike against Soviet command and control was becoming theoretically feasible. The concern was that a sufficiently precise American strike could destroy Soviet leadership before the order to retaliate could be given. Perimeter was designed to solve that problem. It was an automated command system that could independently verify that a nuclear attack had occurred and issue launch orders without requiring authorization from Soviet leadership. The system monitored seismic sensors, radiation detectors, and communications networks. If it detected signatures consistent with nuclear detonations on Soviet territory, and if it also detected that normal command communications had gone silent, it was designed to launch a retaliatory strike autonomously. A small crew of officers, housed in a hardened underground command post, could activate the system and then take no further action. The system would do the rest. The existence of perimeter was not publicly known in the West until 1993, when a former Soviet official described it to a reporter. The American government had been aware of it earlier through intelligence channels. The system, or some version of it, is believed to still be operational. It represents the endpoint of the logic that drove so much of the Cold War's institutional behavior. The problem of human hesitation in a nuclear crisis had been solved by removing human beings from the process. The guarantee of retaliation had been made absolute by making it automatic. What had been built was a machine whose entire purpose was to ensure that if civilization ended, it would end symmetrically. Operation Gladio was a different kind of program, operating in a different register of secrecy. It was a NATO-coordinated network of stay-behind organizations established across Western Europe in the late 1940s and 1950s. The premise was straightforward. If the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe and occupied its territory, the conventional military forces of NATO would be unable to respond quickly enough to prevent Soviet control from being established. Stay-behind networks, composed of trained personnel who would remain in occupied territory, could conduct guerrilla operations, gather intelligence, and maintain resistance until NATO forces could mount a counteroffensive. The networks were real. They were equipped with caches of weapons, explosives, and communications equipment buried across Western European countries. They were funded and trained by the CIA and the British Secret Intelligence Service in coordination with the intelligence services of the host nations. And they operated, in at least some cases, in ways that went beyond their stated defensive purpose. In Italy, investigations that began in the 1980s and accelerated after a former operative testified before a parliamentary commission in 1990 revealed connections between the Italian stay-behind network and a series of domestic terrorist attacks during the period known as the Years of Lead. The precise nature and extent of those connections remains disputed. What is not disputed is that Gladio existed, that it operated for decades without the knowledge of the parliaments of the countries in which it was embedded, and that when its existence was publicly confirmed, the response from the governments involved was to acknowledge the program while providing minimal detail about its actual operations. The stay-behind concept extended into an area that was even less publicly acknowledged. The United States and its NATO allies developed plans and capabilities for what was described internally as unconventional warfare support operations, which included the capacity to stage provocations in occupied or contested territory that could be attributed to Soviet or Warsaw Pact forces. The documentation of these capabilities is fragmentary, and the extent to which they were actually employed remains a matter of ongoing historical investigation. What is clear is that the infrastructure for such operations was built and maintained, and that the institutional framework that housed it treated the distinction between defensive resistance operations and offensive provocation operations as a practical rather than a moral question. The nuclear weapons safety record of the Cold War is a subject that took decades to emerge into public view, and the picture it presents is different from the one that was managed for public consumption during the period itself. The official position, maintained consistently throughout the Cold War, was that American nuclear weapons were subject to rigorous safety protocols that made accidental detonation effectively impossible. The classification of documents related to nuclear accidents, known in military terminology as broken arrows, ensured that the public record of close calls remained incomplete. The 1961 accident over Goldsboro, North Carolina, is now reasonably well documented. A B-52 carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs broke apart in flight during a routine mission. Both bombs fell. One of them went through several of the arming steps in sequence. A single safety mechanism, later determined to be a low-voltage switch that cost a few dollars, was the only barrier between a completed arming sequence and detonation. The yield of each bomb was 3 to 4 megatons. The area of severe blast damage from a detonation would have extended across a significant portion of North Carolina. The prevailing winds at the time would have carried the fallout plume in a direction that included Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. The internal assessment of this incident, which was not fully declassified until 2013, concluded that the bomb had come close to detonating. The public statement at the time was that there had been no danger of a nuclear explosion. This was not accurate, and the people who made the statement knew it was not accurate. The decision to manage the public information about the Goldsboro incident was consistent with a broader institutional approach to nuclear accidents that treated the disclosure of close calls as a threat to public confidence in the nuclear deterrent. If the public understood how close the weapons were to accidental detonation, the argument for the deterrent, which rested on the assumption that the weapons were under firm and reliable control, would be undermined. The Goldsboro incident was not unique. The list of documented broken arrow incidents acknowledged by the Department of Defense includes 32 events. Researchers who have examined the classified record, including those who obtained documents through Freedom of Information Act requests and through cooperation with former officials, have concluded that the documented list understates the actual number of incidents. The accidents that were acknowledged were the ones that could not be completely concealed. The incidents that left no recoverable evidence or that were managed entirely within the military structure without civilian casualties or witnesses may not appear in any public record at all. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the Cold War event that has received more historical attention than almost any other, and the public narrative around it has been refined over decades as new documents have emerged. What that refinement has produced is a picture of the crisis that is considerably more frightening than the one that was understood at the time. The decision-making that ultimately led to a peaceful resolution was not the product of rational actors operating with full information and clear judgment. It was the product of a series of near accidents, miscommunications, and individual decisions made under extreme stress by people who did not know what the other side was actually doing. The most significant of these was the situation aboard Soviet submarine B-59. The submarine was operating near the naval quarantine line that American ships had established around Cuba. It had been out of contact with Moscow for several days. Its batteries were running low, and American destroyers were using practice depth charges, which the submarine crew did not know were practice depth charges, to force it to the surface. The submarine's captain believed that war might already have started. He believed that an order to use his nuclear torpedo, which required the agreement of 3 officers, was potentially justified given the circumstances. 2 of the 3 officers required for authorization agreed that the torpedo should be used. The 3rd officer, Vasily Arkhipov, who was the flotilla commander aboard the submarine, refused to authorize the launch. The submarine surfaced without firing. The record of what happened aboard B-59 was not known to American decision-makers during the crisis. It was not known to the public for decades. The name Vasily Arkhipov did not enter the historical record in any significant way until the 1990s. The moment in which the crisis came closest to becoming a nuclear exchange was not visible to the people who were supposedly managing the crisis from above. It was a decision made in the dark, by a man whose name almost no one knew, in circumstances that were entirely outside the crisis management framework that historians would later analyze. There was another incident during the Cuban Missile Crisis that has received less attention but is no less significant. On October 28, 1962, as the crisis was approaching its resolution, a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, piloted by Captain Charles Maltzby, became lost during a routine sampling mission over the Arctic and crossed into Soviet airspace. Soviet fighters were scrambled to intercept it. American F-102 fighters armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles were scrambled to escort it back. The F-102s were authorized to use their nuclear weapons at the pilot's discretion in the event of an engagement with Soviet forces. The U-2 eventually found its way back to Alaska without an engagement occurring. But for a period of time, American aircraft armed with nuclear weapons were in potential engagement range of Soviet aircraft during the most dangerous week of the Cold War, and the authorization to use those weapons rested with individual pilots who had no visibility into the diplomatic process that was simultaneously seeking to end the crisis. Project Jennifer, later known as Project Azorian, was an operation that demonstrated a different dimension of Cold War institutional capacity. In 1968, a Soviet Gulf-class submarine carrying nuclear ballistic missiles sank in the Pacific Ocean. The United States Navy located the wreck in approximately 16,000 feet of water. The CIA proposed a covert operation to raise the submarine and recover its nuclear weapons, its cryptographic equipment, and whatever intelligence material it might contain. The plan that was developed involved the construction of a specialized deep-sea recovery vessel, which was publicly described as a commercial ocean mining ship. The vessel was the Hughes Glomar Explorer, nominally operated by Howard Hughes's organization as cover for the actual mission. The operation proceeded over several years. The technical achievement of the recovery attempt was extraordinary. The Glomar Explorer used a massive claw mechanism to attempt to lift the submarine from the seafloor. In July 1974, the attempt was made. The submarine broke apart during the lift, and only a portion of the forward section was successfully recovered. The material that was recovered included the bodies of several Soviet sailors who were given a burial at sea that was later declassified and made available to Russia as a gesture. The nuclear missiles and the cryptographic equipment, which were in the sections that broke off during the recovery, were not retrieved. The operation remained secret during its execution. Its existence became known to the public in 1975 when details appeared in the press. The disclosure of the operation created a specific institutional problem. The CIA requested that news organizations withhold publication on national security grounds. Several did for a period. When the story eventually became public, the official response was carefully managed to acknowledge the operation while limiting the detail available about its precise objectives and findings. Project Azorian represents the Cold War's capacity for institutional ambition, operating in complete secrecy, on a scale and at a technical complexity that would have seemed implausible if described as a hypothetical. The development of biological weapons programs during the Cold War was subject to a treaty regime that both superpowers publicly endorsed and privately treated as an obstacle rather than a constraint. The Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 prohibited the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. The Soviet Union signed the convention. It also continued, under a program that was bureaucratically separated from the entities that had formally agreed to the treaty, to operate the largest offensive biological weapons program in history. The program, known by its institutional designation as Biopreparat, employed tens of thousands of scientists and support personnel at dozens of facilities across the Soviet Union. It worked on the weaponization of anthrax, smallpox, plague, and dozens of other pathogens. It developed delivery systems, it conducted open-air tests, and it did all of this while Soviet representatives participated in the international treaty regime that nominally prohibited exactly this activity. The existence of biopreparat became known to the West through the testimony of Ken Alibek, a senior official in the program who defected in 1992. The scale of what he described was not fully believed initially, in part because accepting it required accepting that the Soviet treaty compliance had been entirely performative for 2 decades. The American biological weapons program had been terminated in 1969 under President Nixon, and the United States had destroyed its stockpiles under international verification. The Soviet program had not. The asymmetry between the two sides on this particular weapon system was not known to American policymakers with any precision until after the Soviet collapse. The treaty regime that was supposed to govern biological weapons had been operating for 20 years, with one signatory in compliance and the other in comprehensive violation. The institutional apparatus of verification had not caught this, because the verification mechanisms built into the convention were, by design, inadequate to detect a program that was specifically structured to evade them. Operation Northwoods is a program whose documentation is now publicly available and whose existence is fully confirmed, yet it still occupies an uncomfortable position in the official narrative of the Cold War because of what it reveals about institutional thinking at the highest levels of the American military. In 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff presented Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara with a document that proposed a series of covert operations designed to provide a pretext for American military intervention in Cuba. The operations proposed included the staging of terrorist attacks on American soil that could be attributed to Cuba, the shooting down of American aircraft in circumstances that could be blamed on Cuban forces, and the sinking of a United States Navy vessel with American casualties that could be used to generate public support for military action. The document was signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It was a formal institutional proposal, not a fringe idea from a single individual. McNamara rejected it. President Kennedy was reportedly furious when he was informed of its contents. The military officers who had produced it continued in their careers. The document itself was classified and remained unknown to the public until 1997, when it was released as part of the Assassination Records Review Board's declassification process. Its existence confirms something about the institutional culture of Cold War military planning that is difficult to integrate into the standard narrative of American conduct during the period. The proposal to stage domestic terrorist attacks and civilian casualties as a pretext for war was not produced by rogue actors. It came from the top of the military command structure and was presented through formal channels as a serious operational plan. The intelligence programs directed against American citizens during the Cold War were extensive, and the documentation of their scope has emerged over decades through congressional investigations, judicial proceedings, and declassification. COINTELPRO, the FBI counterintelligence program that ran from 1956 to 1971, targeted domestic political organizations ranging from the Communist Party to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to anti-war groups to the American Indian Movement. The tactics employed included infiltration, anonymous letters designed to create internal conflict within targeted organizations, the fabrication of evidence to support prosecutorial action, and in documented cases, coordination with local law enforcement in actions that resulted in violence against targeted individuals. The COINTELPRO files that became available through a 1971 burglary of an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and through subsequent congressional investigation, revealed a program that treated domestic political dissent as a national security threat to be neutralized rather than as constitutionally protected activity to be tolerated. The program operated without judicial oversight or legislative authorization. It operated for 15 years within the institutional structure of the federal government. When it became public, the response was to terminate the specific program while leaving intact the legal and institutional framework that had made it possible. The CIA's parallel domestic programs operated under different designations and at different levels of institutional acknowledgement. Operation Chaos, which ran from 1967 to 1974, was a domestic surveillance program directed at anti-war activists and other dissident groups. It maintained files on thousands of American citizens. MKultra, which began in the early 1950s and ran for over 2 decades, was a program of covert research into techniques of psychological manipulation and interrogation that included the non-consensual administration of psychoactive drugs to American and Canadian citizens, including patients in psychiatric facilities who had no knowledge that they were being used as research subjects. The MKultra documentation was largely destroyed in 1973 on the orders of CIA Director Richard Helms, who was aware that congressional investigations were imminent. The documents that survived did so because they had been misfiled in a financial records facility rather than stored with the operational files that were destroyed. What those surviving documents revealed, and what testimony from researchers and former officials subsequently confirmed, was a program that had operated in complete disregard of the legal and ethical constraints that nominally governed human experimentation. The program had used hospitals, universities, prisons, and front organizations as venues for research. It had administered LSD, barbiturates, mescaline, and other substances to subjects who did not know they were being drugged. At least one death was directly attributable to the program. The number of people affected by the research who were never identified or compensated is not known. The nuclear war planning of the Cold War produced infrastructure that was built to survive the destruction of everything above ground. The construction of continuity of government facilities, hardened command posts, and underground installations was a massive undertaking that proceeded with minimal public disclosure for decades. The Greenbrier, a resort hotel in West Virginia, housed a classified congressional relocation facility from 1958 until its existence was revealed by a Washington Post reporter in 1992. The facility included sleeping quarters, a medical center, a decontamination chamber, and communications equipment sufficient to allow Congress to continue functioning after a nuclear attack. It was maintained in readiness for 34 years without any of the guests who stayed at the resort above it being aware of its existence. The Greenbrier facility was one node in a system that included Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, the Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia, and numerous other installations whose existence and purpose were classified at various levels. The logic behind this infrastructure was that the survival of government institutions was a military necessity, and that the people who would inhabit the survival facilities after a nuclear exchange were more important to the continuation of the state than the civilians who had no such facilities available. This logic was never publicly debated. The decisions about who would be included in the continuity of government plans and who would not were made administratively within the national security apparatus, without the knowledge of the people whose survival was not being planned for. The nuclear weapons storage arrangements of the Cold War in Europe were subject to political sensitivities that required significant institutional management. The American decision to station tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe, including in countries whose publics were deeply ambivalent about hosting such weapons, produced arrangements that were carefully managed in terms of what was publicly acknowledged. In some cases, the host government was formally aware of the weapons while maintaining public deniability. In other cases, the arrangements were more complicated. The accident at the Palomares, Spain, in January 1966 created a disclosure problem that illustrates how these arrangements worked in practice. A B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided with a refueling tanker over the Spanish coast. 3 of the bombs fell on land near the fishing village of Palomares. 1 fell into the sea. The conventional explosives in 2 of the bombs detonated on impact, scattering plutonium across an area of approximately 500 acres of Spanish farmland. The bomb that fell into the sea was not recovered for nearly 3 months. The contamination cleanup required the removal and transport to the United States of approximately 1,400 tons of Spanish soil. The Spanish government of Francisco Franco had not publicly acknowledged the presence of American nuclear weapons in Spanish airspace. The accident made that deniability impossible to maintain, but the political management of the aftermath was designed to limit the damage to the arrangement. American and Spanish officials conducted press conferences in which they swam in the sea near Palomares to demonstrate that the water was safe. The decontamination of the land was conducted under military rather than civilian oversight. The long-term health monitoring of the Palomares population, which continued for decades under the terms of an agreement between Spain and the United States, was conducted quietly. The full extent of the contamination and its long-term health effects remained a subject of ongoing study and ongoing political sensitivity for over 50 years. The early warning systems that were supposed to prevent nuclear war by providing reliable information about incoming attacks had a failure mode that was not publicized during the Cold War, and that became known only gradually as the events themselves aged into history. The systems produced false alarms. They produced them regularly, and the protocols for responding to false alarms required rapid escalation through chains of command that were not designed with the assumption that the alarms would frequently be wrong. In November 1979, a training tape containing a scenario of a full-scale Soviet missile attack was mistakenly loaded into the computers of the North American Aerospace Defense Command. The computers presented the scenario as a real event. Missile warning centers went to high alert. Fighter aircraft were launched. The National Military Command Center began the process of notifying senior officials. The error was identified after approximately 6 minutes. The error was identified in part because the satellite systems that were supposed to confirm the missile launches showed nothing. The notification had not yet reached the people with the authority to authorize a launch when the false alarm was resolved. Less than a year later, in June 1980, a 46-cent computer chip failed in the communication system at NORAD. The failure caused the system to display inconsistent readings that appeared to show incoming Soviet submarine-launched missiles. The number displayed fluctuated between 2 and 200 as the chip malfunction produced random outputs. The alert was raised. Bomber crews went to readiness. The confusion produced by the inconsistent numbers was part of what prevented the alert from escalating further before the technical failure was identified. On the Soviet side, the most significant documented false alarm occurred in September 1983. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer at a Soviet missile warning facility when the facility's satellite detection system reported that the United States had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles. The system classified the alert as having the highest level of reliability. The protocol in Petrov's position was to report the launch detection up the chain of command, which would have initiated the Soviet response sequence. Petrov judged the report to be a false alarm based on 2 factors. First, he believed that a genuine American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. Second, the satellite system was new, and he had doubts about its reliability. He reported the detection as a system malfunction and did not pass the alert upward. He was correct. The system had been triggered by a rare alignment of sunlight reflections from high-altitude clouds that the satellite's sensors had interpreted as missile exhaust plumes. The Soviet response procedure, if Petrov had followed it, would have initiated a sequence that led to the highest level of Soviet military command at a moment when the warning systems were indicating an American first strike. What would have happened at that level of command, in the specific political context of September 1983, when relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were at one of their lowest points of the entire Cold War, is not knowable. What is known is that the procedure which was supposed to govern the situation called for something different from what Petrov did. He deviated from protocol. The deviation may have prevented an irreversible escalation. Petrov was not formally recognized for his decision. He was, in some accounts, subjected to criticism for not following procedure. The incident was classified for years and became known in the West only after the Soviet Union dissolved. The system that had nearly triggered a crisis was repaired and continued in operation. The vulnerability that Petrov's decision had exposed The fact that the response protocol called for escalation before any confirmation beyond the satellite system itself was available was addressed through technical adjustments rather than through any public examination of the institutional logic that had created it. The weapons programs of the Cold War extended into domains that were not governed by any treaty regime, and that therefore proceeded without the constraint of even the minimal verification mechanisms that the nuclear arena had developed. Space was one such domain. The United States and the Soviet Union both developed and tested anti-satellite weapons during the Cold War. The Soviet program, known as Istrebitel Sputnikov, or Satellite Destroyer, conducted dozens of tests between 1968 and 1982. The American program, which used modified ballistic missiles and later aircraft-launched missiles, was tested against actual satellites. The specific danger posed by anti-satellite weapons in the Cold War context was not primarily military. It was operational. The early warning systems, the communications infrastructure, and the reconnaissance capabilities that both sides depended on to avoid accidental nuclear war were increasingly dependent on satellites. A conflict that began with anti-satellite attacks would, in the early stages, destroy the very systems that were supposed to provide warning, communications, and targeting information to the humans who were supposed to be making decisions. A war that began by blinding both sides was a war that would proceed without the information infrastructure that the command and control architecture assumed would be available. This vulnerability was understood within both military establishments. It was not resolved. The anti-satellite programs continued because the military value of being able to destroy the other side's reconnaissance and communications satellites was assessed as outweighing the systemic risk. The assessment was correct in isolation. In the context of a crisis in which early warning and communication systems were already stressed, it was an assessment that did not account for what eliminating those systems would do to the decision-making process that was supposed to prevent escalation. The nuclear weapons programs of both superpowers included delivery systems that were never publicly disclosed during the Cold War, and whose existence became known only through the slow accumulation of declassified documents and defector testimony. The Soviet Union developed and deployed a system known as the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, or FOBS, in the late 1960s. The system placed nuclear warheads into partial orbital trajectories rather than the ballistic trajectories that American early warning systems were specifically designed to detect. A FOBS weapon approaching from the south over the Antarctic rather than over the Arctic would arrive from a direction and at an angle that the DEW line and other radar networks of the period were not oriented to track. The American military became aware of the FOBS program and its implications for the reliability of early warning. The response was not public disclosure. It was an internal acknowledgement that the early warning architecture had a significant gap, combined with efforts to develop additional detection capabilities that could partially address the gap. The public continued to operate under the assumption that the early warning system was comprehensive. The internal assessment was that it was not. The gap represented a window in which a Soviet first strike using FOBS delivery could arrive with little or no warning, and the management of that vulnerability was conducted within the classified structure without any public discussion of what the existence of such a system implied about the stability of the deterrent. Project Azorian has been mentioned in the context of submarine recovery, but the submarine intelligence program of which it was a part was considerably broader and represents one of the most sustained covert technical operations of the Cold War. The American Navy developed over the course of the 1970s the capability to tap undersea Soviet communications cables. Operation Ivy Bells, which ran from approximately 1971 until its exposure in 1981, involved Navy divers and submariners installing recording devices on Soviet military communications cables on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk. The cables carried unencrypted communications between Soviet Pacific Fleet installations on the assumption that the physical inaccessibility of the cables made them secure from interception. The taps provided significant intelligence for approximately a decade. The program was exposed not by Soviet technical detection, but by espionage. Ronald Pelton, a former NSA employee, sold information about the program to Soviet intelligence. The recording devices were recovered by Soviet forces in 1981. The exposure of Ivy Bells ended the specific operation, but the capability that had been developed was not abandoned. The program represents a category of Cold War intelligence collection that operated in complete secrecy, and that demonstrated the range of technical innovation that the secrecy requirement both enabled and demanded. The absence of any public accountability created the space for operations that required years of sustained effort, significant resources, and the participation of hundreds of people who maintained the secret throughout and afterward. The management of information about Soviet military capabilities within the American national security establishment produced its own pathologies during the Cold War. The Team B exercise of 1976 is an example of how the institutional pressure to view Soviet capabilities in the worst possible light could produce intelligence assessments that drove policy in directions not supported by the actual evidence. Team B was an external group of analysts, including several who would later hold prominent positions in the Reagan administration, brought in to challenge the CIA's official assessment of Soviet strategic capabilities. The Team B report concluded that Soviet military capabilities and intentions were significantly more threatening than the CIA's own analysts had concluded. The Team B assessment drove policy decisions, including the accelerated development of new weapons systems, and contributed to the political environment that produced the massive defense buildup of the early 1980s. Subsequent analysis, enabled by access to Soviet archives after the Cold War ended, concluded that Team B's assessment had significantly overstated Soviet capabilities in several key areas. The strategic bomber gap, the civil defense program capability, and the accuracy of Soviet strategic missiles were all assessed more pessimistically than the actual evidence warranted. The institutional pressure to assume the worst about the adversary and the political utility of maintaining that assumption had produced an intelligence product that was consistently biased in a particular direction and that influenced resource allocation and policy for years. The nuclear test program conducted by both superpowers exposed populations to radiation in ways that were not publicly disclosed. The United States nuclear testing program at the Nevada test site, which conducted above-ground tests from 1951 to 1963, produced fallout that was distributed across downwind communities in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. The populations of these communities, known in the epidemiological literature and eventually in legal proceedings as downwinders, received radiation doses from the tests that were not disclosed to them at the time. The public statements about the safety of the tests did not reflect the internal assessments that were being made about the radiation doses reaching populated areas. The epidemiological evidence that accumulated over subsequent decades showed elevated rates of certain cancers in downwind communities. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, passed in 1990, represented a formal government acknowledgement that downwinders had been harmed by the testing program. But the specific decision-making process by which officials had decided to continue testing while managing the public information about its risks remained classified for years. The documents that eventually became available showed that the decision to continue above-ground testing in the face of internal concerns about downwinder exposure was made at senior levels, and that the public messaging about safety was inconsistent with what those officials knew. The Soviet nuclear testing program at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan exposed the surrounding population to radiation on a scale that was not publicly acknowledged during the Soviet period, and whose full extent was not known even within the Soviet Union due to the classification of health data from the region. Testing at Semipalatinsk began in 1949 and continued, including above-ground tests, until 1963. The population of the region was not evacuated or warned. The health consequences for the population of northeastern Kazakhstan were significant and long-lasting. The Soviet medical data from the region was classified, and the scientists who studied the affected population were themselves subject to institutional pressures that discouraged the documentation of findings that might reflect negatively on the testing program. The civil defense programs of both superpowers represented another domain of Cold War institutional activity in which the public presentation diverged significantly from the internal assessment. The American Civil Defense Program produced, at various times, advice about how civilians could survive a nuclear attack through measures including the construction of backyard fallout shelters, the maintenance of emergency food supplies, and evacuation procedures. The internal assessments that accompanied these programs included analyses of their likely effectiveness that were considerably more pessimistic than the public messaging. The classified studies of blast effects, thermal radiation, and fallout distribution from nuclear weapons of the yields that were actually being deployed by both superpowers indicated that the civil defense measures being publicly recommended would provide meaningful protection only for weapons much smaller than the ones that would actually be used, and only in scenarios in which the attack was limited in ways that no serious military planner expected any actual attack to be. The civil defense program was maintained and publicly promoted, not primarily because it would save lives in any realistic nuclear attack scenario, but because the act of preparing for nuclear attack served a purpose in the psychological management of the civilian population's relationship to the nuclear deterrent. It implied agency and survivability in a situation where the internal assessment was that there was very little of either. The Soviet Civil Defense Program operated under similar institutional logic, but with different specific features. The Soviet program, which was considerably more extensive in terms of the infrastructure built and the public participation required, served domestic political purposes as well as the strategic purpose of potentially preserving a larger fraction of the Soviet industrial base and leadership structure in the event of nuclear exchange. The existence of the Soviet program was used by American analysts who wanted to argue that the Soviet Union was preparing for a nuclear war-fighting strategy rather than a purely deterrent one. This argument drove some of the Team B analysis and contributed to the political environment of the late 1970s and early 1980s. The interpretation of Soviet civil defense preparations as evidence of aggressive strategic intent was contested at the time and has been contested since, but it illustrates how the institutional machinery of Cold War threat assessment could generate policy-driving conclusions from ambiguous evidence. The Able Archer 83 exercise conducted by NATO in November 1983 produced a crisis that was entirely invisible to the people who were supposedly managing it. The exercise was a command post simulation of NATO procedures for the transition from conventional to nuclear war. It involved realistic communications, realistic procedures, and realistic coordination between NATO commands across Europe. Soviet intelligence, which had been following NATO exercise patterns for years as part of Operation Ryan, a program specifically designed to detect indicators of a NATO surprise nuclear attack, assessed Able Archer 83 as potentially being the cover for an actual nuclear attack preparation. Soviet forces in Europe were placed on heightened alert. Soviet nuclear-capable aircraft in Eastern Europe were armed and readied. The British intelligence service received information through its asset, Oleg Gordievsky, that indicated the genuine nature of Soviet concern. This information was passed to the American government, which had not fully appreciated that the Soviets might interpret the exercise as a real attack preparation. The exercise concluded without an incident. The crisis it had generated within Soviet military command was not fully known to American and NATO officials at the time. The Reagan administration received a fuller picture of what had happened in subsequent months and took it seriously enough to modify subsequent exercises to reduce the realistic elements that had contributed to the Soviet misreading. The Able Archer episode is significant not because it produced an incident, but because it reveals the gap between what decision-makers thought was happening and what was actually happening in the institutions they were ostensibly directing. The exercise proceeded as planned. The crisis it generated was invisible to those running it. The resolution was not the product of any deliberate action by the people nominally in charge, but was the result of the exercise ending on schedule and Soviet forces standing down when the expected attack failed to materialize. The institutional machinery had created a crisis without anyone intending to, and had resolved it without anyone managing the resolution. The final program in this account is perhaps the most abstract, and it encompasses all the others. Throughout the Cold War, both superpowers developed and refined the institutional, technical, and doctrinal frameworks for nuclear war in ways that created systems with enormous inertia and internal logic. The weapons were built, deployed, and maintained. The command structures were established. The launch authorities were delegated. The early warning systems were connected to the alert procedures. The alert procedures were connected to the launch protocols. The launch protocols were designed to function under conditions of destroyed communications, degraded command structures, and incomplete information. The systems were designed to work even if the people nominally in charge of them were dead or incapacitated. They were designed to work even if the information they were operating on was incomplete or ambiguous. They were designed to work in conditions that made deliberate human decision-making impossible. The design requirement was that the deterrent remain credible under any circumstances, including the circumstances in which it would actually be used. The result was a system whose entire architecture assumed that a situation requiring its use was one in which normal human decision-making capacity had already been compromised. The Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991. The systems that had been built to fight it did not dissolve with it. The weapons remained. The command structures remained, modified and reduced, but structurally intact. The doctrines evolved, but retained the core architecture developed over 4 decades. The early warning systems continued to operate and continued to generate false alarms. The perimeter system, on the Soviet and then the Russian side, continued to exist. The PSYOP was eventually replaced by more flexible nuclear war plans, but the fundamental logic of maintaining a ready and responsive nuclear force did not change. The programs described here were erased from public history, not through any single decision, but through the accumulated effect of classification, institutional inertia, and the practical difficulty of disclosing information that implicated ongoing capabilities and relationships. Some became known through leaks, some through declassification, some through the testimony of people who had been inside them and decided for various reasons to speak. Some remain partially or entirely obscure. The ones that are fully known share a common feature with the ones that are not. They were all produced by institutions operating according to an internal logic that was entirely consistent with the assumptions of the period. The assumption was that the adversary was capable of anything and would attempt everything. The response to that assumption was to build systems that could match anything and respond to everything. The systems that were built outlasted the specific confrontation that justified them, and the logic that produced them, the logic that treated security as a problem to be solved through readiness rather than restraint, did not end when the Cold War did.